Hey guys. Tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of poison, power, and political terror. We're diving into what life was really like for the Mortavia family, one of the most ruthless dynasties in history. Forget the noble houses Hollywood sold you. The truth, you probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The midnight feast at Sanctum Castle had been proceeding exactly as Lord Maximilian Mortavia intended. Golden chalices filled with the finest wine gleamed under flickering candlelight, casting dancing shadows across the faces of his carefully selected guests. Each person seated at the long oak table represented a potential threat to his growing empire. Influential lords and merchants who had been quietly opposing his expansion across the Auvergne territories, tonight would silence their resistance permanently. Maximilian raised his own chalice, observing with cold satisfaction as his guests followed suit. The wine within was a deep crimson, almost black in the dim light, aged in cellars beneath the castle, where other more sinister concoctions were also prepared. His weathered face remained expressionless as he watched each guest bring the precious liquid to their lips. Years of orchestrating such moments had taught him to suppress any visible emotion that might betray his intentions. The first guest to collapse was Lord Benedict of Valoria, a rotund man whose opposition to Mortavia trade routes had been particularly vocal in recent months. His face flushed red, then purple, as his hands clawed desperately at his throat. The chalice fell from his grip, clattering against the stone floor as wine spread like blood across the ancient stones. Within moments, convulsions seized his body, his eyes rolling back as foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. Lady Cordelia of Westmarch followed next, her elegant composure crumbling as the poison coursed through her system. She had been instrumental in organizing the southern lords against Maximilian's territorial ambitions, using her family's considerable wealth to fund resistance efforts. Now, she doubled over in agony, her silk gown soaking up the wine that she vomited uncontrollably. Her perfectly arranged hair fell loose around her contorted face as death claimed her with ruthless efficiency. One by one, the remaining guests succumbed to the carefully crafted toxin. Merchant Prince Aldrich, whose shipping fleets had refused to carry Mortavia goods, writhed on the floor beside his overturned chair. Count Eduardo, who had been secretly funding bandits to attack Mortavia caravans, gasped his final breaths while staring accusingly at his host. The grand dining hall, moments before filled with polite conversation and the gentle clinking of silverware, now echoed with the sounds of death rattles and final gasps. Maximilian observed the carnage with detached interest, occasionally sipping from his own chalice, which contained perfectly safe wine drawn from a different cask. His personal physician had spent months perfecting this particular poison, derived from a rare fungus found only in the deepest caves beneath Sanctum Castle. The toxin was nearly undetectable when properly prepared, causing symptoms that could easily be mistaken for sudden illness or bad food. More importantly, it acted quickly enough to prevent any of his victims from escaping to warn others. The servants who entered to clear the bodies had been in Mortavia employ for decades, their loyalty purchased through a combination of generous compensation and intimate knowledge of what happened to those who betrayed their master. They moved efficiently around the table, checking for signs of life before beginning the grim task of disposal. Each corpse would be transported to predetermined locations throughout the region, arranged to suggest accidents or natural deaths that would raise no suspicions among local authorities. This massacre represented more than simple elimination of political opposition. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of the Mortavia family's primary source of power: the mastery of death through poison. While other noble houses relied on armies and open warfare to expand their influence, the Mortavias had perfected the art of silent elimination. Their enemies rarely saw death coming, often trusting the very goblets and plates that delivered their doom. Sanctum Castle stood as a monument to this philosophy, its imposing walls rising from a rocky promontory overlooking the bustling port city of Avernia. From his solar window, Maximilian could observe the merchant ships that brought exotic goods from distant lands, many carrying ingredients essential to his family's deadly craft. The castle's kitchens concealed laboratories where master poisoners worked alongside cooks, ensuring that hospitality and murder could be seamlessly combined when necessary. The Mortavia coat of arms displayed prominently throughout the castle featured a silver chalice on a field of midnight blue surrounded by thorny vines that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight. Most visitors interpreted the imagery as symbolic of hospitality and abundance, never suspecting that it actually represented the family's preferred method of eliminating obstacles. The chalice was death disguised as generosity, the thorns a reminder that every gift from the Mortavias came with hidden barbs. Maximilian's rise to power had not been sudden or accidental. Born the third son of a minor lord, he had recognized early that traditional paths to influence were closed to him. His elder brothers would inherit lands and titles, leaving him with little more than a modest allowance and the expectation that he would pursue a career in the church or military. Instead, he had chosen a different course, one that required patience, intelligence, and a complete absence of conventional morality. His education in the poisoner's art had begun during his youth, when he discovered his family's old alchemical texts hidden in the castle's forgotten chambers. These ancient volumes, written by ancestors who had dabbled in the darker aspects of natural philosophy, contained detailed recipes for toxins and antidotes that had been lost to conventional knowledge. Maximilian spent years studying these works, conducting careful experiments on small animals, before gradually testing his concoctions on unwary humans. The first person he ever poisoned was his own tutor, an elderly priest who had caught him reading the forbidden texts and threatened to inform his father. The old man's death was attributed to a weak heart, and Maximilian's secret remained safe. More importantly, he had learned that he possessed the cold temperament necessary for this particular art. While others might be paralyzed by guilt or fear of discovery, he felt only satisfaction at the successful execution of his plan. As years passed, unfortunate accidents began to befall those who stood between Maximilian and his ambitions. His eldest brother died suddenly after a hunting expedition, apparently from contaminated food prepared during their wilderness camp. His second brother succumbed to a mysterious illness that baffled the castle's physicians, passing away just as his father was preparing to name him heir. Their father himself lived only a few months longer, long enough to acknowledge Maximilian as his successor before suffering a fatal stroke that left him unable to speak or move. The Mortavia lands that Maximilian inherited were modest but strategically located. Sanctum Castle controlled a vital trade route between the mountainous interior and the coastal regions, allowing him to levy taxes on merchant caravans and shipping traffic. More importantly, the territory included several rare mineral deposits and unusual plant species that provided essential ingredients for his expanding collection of toxins. The caves beneath the castle harbored fungi and minerals found nowhere else in the known world, giving him access to poisons that no rival could replicate or counter. Under Maximilian's leadership, the Mortavia influence spread like poison through wine. He never conquered territory through military force, preferring instead to eliminate key leaders and allow their successors to voluntarily submit to his authority. Local lords who might have resisted an open invasion found themselves inexplicably isolated, as their allies died from sudden illnesses or unfortunate accidents. Resistance movements collapsed when their leaders mysteriously perished, leaving their followers leaderless and demoralized. The city of Avernia itself had fallen under Mortavia control through a particularly elegant campaign of targeted assassinations. The ruling merchant council had been systematically eliminated over the course of 2 years. Their deaths spread far enough apart to avoid suspicion, but frequent enough to create an atmosphere of terror among the remaining leadership. When Maximilian finally offered his protection services to the surviving merchants, they accepted gratefully, never realizing that he had been orchestrating the very threats they feared. This pattern repeated itself throughout the region as Maximilian's influence expanded. He cultivated a reputation as a generous patron and wise leader, always arriving to offer assistance in the aftermath of the very disasters he had secretly orchestrated. His offers of protection were never refused, partly because his terms seemed reasonable, but mostly because those who might have opposed him had a disturbing tendency to die before they could organize effective resistance. The Mortavia household itself reflected this culture of elegant menace. Every servant, guard, and advisor understood that their continued existence depended upon absolute loyalty and discretion. The castle's staff had been carefully selected for their dependability, often recruited from among the desperate or criminal who had no other options for employment. Once in Mortavia's service, they found themselves well compensated but effectively trapped, knowing too much about their master's activities to ever safely seek employment elsewhere. The dining hall where tonight's massacre had occurred was just one of many chambers designed to facilitate the Mortavia way of conducting business. Hidden passages allowed servants to move unseen, delivering specially prepared food and drink without being observed by guests. The kitchen complex included facilities that appeared to be standard food preparation areas but actually served as sophisticated poison laboratories, complete with distillation equipment and storage for rare ingredients that could kill in quantities smaller than a grain of salt. Maximilian's personal chambers contained an extensive library focused on toxicology, anatomy, and what scholars euphemistically called natural philosophy. Shelf after shelf held volumes describing the properties of deadly plants, the effects of various mineral compounds on the human body, and the subtle art of preparing substances that could kill quickly or slowly, obviously or mysteriously, depending upon the specific requirements of each situation. Many of these books were unique copies, their authors long dead and their knowledge preserved only within the Mortavia collection. The castle's dungeons, rarely used for conventional imprisonment, served instead as testing facilities, where captured enemies or condemned criminals provided unwilling subjects for experiments with new toxins. These unfortunate individuals rarely lived long enough to serve their original sentences, instead becoming data points in Maximilian's ongoing research into the science of murder. Their deaths contributed to an ever-growing understanding of how different poisons affected different types of people, knowledge that made future assassinations even more precise and effective. As dawn approached and the last traces of the midnight feast were cleaned away, Maximilian retired to his study to record the evening's results in his private journal. Each successful poisoning was carefully documented, including details about the specific toxin used, the dosage required, the time elapsed before death, and any unusual symptoms or reactions observed. This meticulous record-keeping had allowed him to refine his techniques over the years, developing an arsenal of substances that could be tailored to specific circumstances and victims. The poison used tonight had performed exactly as expected, providing yet another confirmation of his poisoner's growing skill. Within days, news would spread throughout the region that several prominent lords had died during what appeared to be a cursed feast, victims of some mysterious ailment that had struck without warning. Their deaths would be mourned, their property redistributed among more compliant successors, and their opposition to Mortavia expansion would die with them. But this night's work represented only the beginning of a larger campaign. Maximilian's ambitions extended far beyond the relatively modest territories he currently controlled. His ultimate goal was nothing less than dominance over the entire continent, achieved not through the crude feats of conventional warfare, but through the sophisticated application of fear, poison, and psychological manipulation. Every death brought him closer to this vision, every successful assassination removing another obstacle from his path to absolute power. The Mortavia family motto, carved in ancient script above the great hall's fireplace, read Venom vincit, omnia. Poison conquers all. Tonight had provided yet another demonstration of this fundamental truth. Where armies might fail and diplomacy might falter, the right toxin applied at the right moment could achieve objectives that would otherwise require years of effort and enormous resources. It was an elegant solution to the problem of power, refined through generations of practice into an art form that few could match and none could surpass. As the first light of dawn crept across the castle walls, Maximilian finally allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The foundation of his empire was built upon a simple principle. Every person who might oppose him was merely a potential corpse awaiting the proper catalyst. Tonight had added several more stones to that foundation, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to expand his influence through the careful application of his family's ancestral craft. The Mortavia legacy was written in poison, measured in silent deaths, and calculated in the fear that kept potential enemies awake at night, wondering if their next meal might be their last. It was a legacy that would grow stronger with each passing year, each successful assassination, each demonstration that resistance to Mortavia authority was not merely futile but inevitably fatal. The pursuit of sacred authority had always been Maximilian's ultimate ambition, far beyond the temporal power he wielded through poison and fear. While controlling trade routes and eliminating political rivals provided wealth and influence, true dominance required legitimacy that could only come from divine appointment. The high sanctum of Avernia, the region's paramount religious authority, represented the pinnacle of power that combined spiritual leadership with temporal control over millions of faithful believers. Cardinal Benedictus Moravec had held this exalted position for nearly 2 decades, his stern leadership and apparent incorruptibility making him one of the few figures in the region who remained beyond Maximilian's direct influence. The cardinal's opposition to the Mortavia expansion had been subtle but persistent, using his moral authority to counsel local lords against submitting to what he privately characterized as a reign of terror disguised as legitimate governance. His weekly sermons, attended by thousands in the Grand Cathedral of Avernia, frequently contained veiled warnings about false shepherds who led their flocks astray through deception and violence. Removing Cardinal Benedictus through conventional assassination would have been relatively simple, but the consequences would have been catastrophic for Maximilian's long-term objectives. The cardinal's sudden death would inevitably be investigated thoroughly, and any evidence of foul play would destroy the carefully cultivated image of legitimacy that Maximilian had spent years building. More importantly, the cardinal's martyrdom would likely inspire exactly the kind of organized religious resistance that could unite Maximilian's enemies under a powerful banner of righteousness. Instead, Maximilian had conceived a more sophisticated approach that would eliminate the cardinal while simultaneously positioning himself as the natural successor to religious authority. This plan required patience, extensive preparation, and a level of psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple poisoning. The goal was not merely to kill Cardinal Benedictus, but to orchestrate his downfall in such a way that Maximilian would appear to be the obvious choice to restore moral leadership to the region. The campaign began with careful cultivation of doubt about the cardinal's personal character. Maximilian's agents, planted throughout the religious hierarchy over many months, began spreading subtle rumors about financial irregularities in the cathedral's accounts. These whispers suggested that substantial donations from faithful believers were being diverted for personal use, though no specific accusations were made that could be directly challenged or disproven. The rumors were crafted to be just plausible enough to plant seeds of suspicion without being so outrageous as to be immediately dismissed. Simultaneously, Maximilian began demonstrating his own apparent devotion to religious principles Through a series of highly visible charitable acts, he funded the construction of new chapels in rural areas, provided generous dowries for orphaned girls entering religious orders, and established schools where poor children could receive basic education alongside religious instruction. These acts of apparent piety were carefully calculated to create a stark contrast with the growing suspicions about Cardinal Benedictus, positioning Maximilian as a model of religious virtue. The next phase involved more direct action against the cardinal's reputation. Maximilian's agents arranged for several young novices to come forward with carefully coached testimonies about inappropriate behavior they claimed to have witnessed in the cardinal's private chambers. These accusations were never specific enough to constitute formal charges, but they were detailed enough to be deeply damaging to the cardinal's moral authority. The fact that multiple witnesses told similar stories gave their testimony an appearance of credibility that would have been lacking from a single accusation. Cardinal Benedictus responded to these mounting pressures exactly as Maximilian had anticipated. His denials of wrongdoing became increasingly desperate and defensive, creating the impression of a man with something to hide rather than an innocent victim of false accusations. His attempts to identify and punish those spreading rumors only served to make him appear vindictive and paranoid, further undermining his once unassailable moral authority. The faithful began to question whether their spiritual leader could be trusted, creating exactly the kind of crisis of confidence that Maximilian needed to justify intervention. The final stage of the campaign required the most delicate timing and execution. Maximilian arranged for evidence of the alleged financial improprieties to be discovered during a carefully orchestrated raid on the cathedral treasury. The planted documents, expertly forged by master counterfeiters in Maximilian's employ, appeared to show that Cardinal Benedictus had been systematically embezzling funds intended for charitable works. The evidence was discovered by apparently independent investigators who had no obvious connection to Maximilian, lending credibility to their findings. When Cardinal Benedictus was formally accused of corruption and misconduct, the scandal erupted across the entire region. Faithful believers who had trusted him with their spiritual welfare felt betrayed and deceived, their anger intensified by the realization that their charitable donations had apparently been stolen for personal gain. The cardinal's protestations of innocence fell on deaf ears, dismissed as the desperate lies of a man caught in his crimes. Public demonstrations outside the cathedral demanded his immediate removal from office, creating pressure that the regional religious council could no longer ignore. The ecclesiastical trial that followed was a masterpiece of judicial theater, carefully orchestrated to ensure the desired outcome while maintaining an appearance of fairness and due process. Maximilian's agents among the clergy ensured that the most damaging evidence received prominent attention, while any testimony that might have supported the cardinal's innocence was quietly suppressed or discredited. The trial judges, many of whom owed their positions to Maximilian's influence, conducted proceedings that appeared thorough and impartial while systematically building a case for conviction. Cardinal Benedictus himself seemed to age years during the weeks of testimony, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a broken old man desperately proclaiming his innocence to audiences that no longer believed him. The weight of false accusations, combined with the apparent betrayal of colleagues he had trusted for decades, destroyed his health as effectively as any poison. He began suffering from what appeared to be stress-related ailments, difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and a persistent tremor that made his hands shake visibly during public appearances. The final blow came when several witnesses testified that they had personally observed the cardinal engaging in the very acts of corruption he denied. These witnesses, all carefully selected and coached by Maximilian's agents, provided testimony that was both convincing and impossible to refute without access to evidence that had been systematically destroyed or hidden. Their accounts painted a picture of systematic abuse of religious authority that shocked even those who had been prepared to believe the worst about their former spiritual leader. When the ecclesiastical court finally rendered its verdict, Cardinal Benedictus was found guilty on all charges and stripped of his religious authority. The formal sentence included banishment from the region and forfeiture of all property and privileges associated with his former position. However, the disgraced cardinal never lived to experience his exile. 3 days after the verdict was announced, he was found dead in his cell, apparently having succumbed to a combination of stress, shame, and the physical deterioration that had been obvious to observers throughout the trial. The cardinal's death was officially attributed to natural causes brought on by the strain of his disgrace, and few questioned this explanation given his obvious decline during the preceding weeks. However, Maximilian knew the truth. Cardinal Benedictus had been given a slow-acting poison that mimicked the symptoms of stress-related illness, while gradually destroying his internal organs. The toxin, derived from a rare mountain herb that grew only in the most remote regions of Maximilian's territory, left no trace that could be detected by conventional medical examination of the era. With Cardinal Benedictus eliminated and his reputation destroyed, the position of High Sanctum stood vacant, creating exactly the opportunity that Maximilian had been working toward for years. The Regional Religious Council, faced with the urgent need to restore moral leadership after such a devastating scandal, began searching for a candidate who could rebuild the faithful's trust in their spiritual authorities. The requirements were obvious. The new leader needed to be above reproach, demonstrably pious, and completely untainted by any association with the corruption that had destroyed their predecessor. Maximilian's campaign for religious authority was conducted with the same meticulous planning that had characterized his destruction of Cardinal Benedictus. Rather than appearing eager for the position, he allowed others to suggest his candidacy, expressing reluctance to abandon his secular responsibilities for the burdens of spiritual leadership. This apparent reluctance only made him seem more suitable for the role, as it suggested that he was motivated by duty rather than personal ambition. His previous charitable works provided evidence of his commitment to religious principles, while his success in temporal governance demonstrated his administrative capability. The selection process itself was largely a formality, as Maximilian's agents among the clergy had spent months building support for his candidacy. Alternative candidates were systematically discredited through carefully planted scandals or eliminated through strategic accidents that prevented them from participating in the selection process. By the time the religious council convened to choose the new High Sanctum, Maximilian was the only viable candidate remaining, his appointment appearing to be both inevitable and unanimously supported. The investiture ceremony that formally elevated Maximilian to religious authority was staged as a moment of spiritual renewal for the entire region. Thousands of faithful believers packed the Grand Cathedral, desperate for reassurance that their spiritual leadership had been restored to righteousness after the trauma of the cardinal's disgrace. Maximilian's acceptance of the sacred vestments was presented as a reluctant sacrifice of personal comfort for the greater good of the faithful, his apparent humility contrasting sharply with the arrogance that had supposedly characterized his predecessor. The new High Sanctum's first official acts reinforced his image as a reformer, committed to restoring moral authority to religious leadership. He announced the establishment of new oversight procedures, designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had destroyed Cardinal Benedictus, though these reforms were carefully structured to strengthen his own control, rather than create genuine accountability. He also proclaimed a period of spiritual renewal, calling upon the faithful to rededicate themselves to religious principles, while simultaneously warning against the dangers of false teachings and unauthorized interpretations of sacred doctrine. Behind the facade of religious reform, Maximilian's elevation to sacred authority provided him with tools of influence that far exceeded anything he had possessed as a secular lord. The High Sanctum's moral pronouncements carried weight throughout the region, allowing him to shape public opinion on matters ranging from political loyalty to commercial practices. Religious festivals and ceremonies became opportunities to reinforce his authority, while identifying potential dissidents who could be marked for future elimination. The extensive network of local clergy provided him with intelligence-gathering capabilities that reached into every community under his influence. The combination of temporal and spiritual authority also created new opportunities for the systematic elimination of enemies through methods that appeared completely legitimate. Religious trials could be used to condemn political opponents as heretics, with execution or exile being presented as necessary measures to protect the faithful from dangerous influences. Suspected dissidents could be required to participate in religious ceremonies that provided perfect opportunities for poisoning, their deaths being attributed to divine judgment rather than human intervention. Maximilian's mastery of poison arts, refined through years of practice, became even more deadly when combined with religious authority. Sacred wine used in ceremonies could be selectively contaminated to eliminate specific individuals, while leaving other participants unharmed. Religious relics could be treated with contact poisons that would kill anyone who touched them with insufficient reverence. Even the holy water used in baptisms and blessings could be weaponized when necessary, turning the most sacred rites into instruments of assassination. The high sanctum's private chambers within the cathedral complex provided Maximilian with new facilities for his continuing research into toxicology and assassination techniques. Hidden laboratories were constructed behind false walls in areas designated for religious study, their existence known only to a handful of trusted assistants who had been selected for their combination of technical skill and absolute discretion. These facilities allowed for the development of increasingly sophisticated poisons, while maintaining the appearance of scholarly religious activity. The cathedral's extensive library became a repository for texts on natural philosophy and alchemical practices that would have been considered suspicious in secular hands, but appeared perfectly legitimate as part of religious scholarship. Ancient treatises on the properties of various substances were reframed as studies of divine creation, while detailed anatomical works were justified as necessary for understanding the miraculous nature of human life. This academic cover allowed Maximilian to expand his knowledge of poisoncraft, while simultaneously strengthening his reputation as a learned and pious leader. The transformation of the cathedral treasury into a funding source for assassination activities required particular care to avoid detection. Donations from faithful believers were systematically diverted to support the purchase of rare ingredients and the employment of specialized craftsmen whose skills were essential to the production of sophisticated toxins. These expenditures were disguised as legitimate religious expenses, hidden among records of charitable works and facility maintenance that would never be questioned by casual examination. The regional religious festivals that Maximilian now controlled became elaborate theater, designed to reinforce his authority while providing cover for elimination activities. The crowds that gathered for these celebrations created perfect conditions for targeted assassinations, as the confusion and excitement made it virtually impossible to identify the source of any particular death. Visiting dignitaries who posed threats to Mortavia interests could be efficiently eliminated during the chaos of religious processions, their deaths being attributed to accidents or medical emergencies rather than deliberate action. Maximilian's sermons from the cathedral pulpit became sophisticated exercises in psychological manipulation, designed to identify potential enemies while reinforcing the loyalty of supporters. His theological pronouncements carefully wove together legitimate religious doctrine with subtle messages about the divine nature of temporal authority and the religious duty of obedience to legitimate ruler. Those who showed signs of disagreement or skepticism during these sermons were quietly noted for future attention, their spiritual counseling sessions becoming opportunities for more targeted persuasion or elimination. The network of local priests and religious officials that reported to the high sanctum provided Maximilian with unprecedented intelligence gathering capabilities throughout his expanding domain. These clergy members, bound by religious vows of obedience, served as his eyes and ears in every community, reporting on political discussions, economic activities, and personal relationships that might be relevant to maintaining control. Their access to the most intimate aspects of people's lives, through confession and spiritual counseling, provided information that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional espionage. The sacrament of confession itself became a tool for identifying threats and gathering intelligence about potential resistance activities. Citizens who confessed to harboring doubts about Maximilian's authority or expressed sympathy for his enemies could be marked for special attention. Their spiritual penance including requirements that brought them into situations where they could be easily monitored or eliminated. The sacred nature of the confessional made it virtually impossible for anyone to refuse participation, while religious doctrine prevented them from suspecting that their most private thoughts were being used against them. As months passed following his elevation to religious authority, Maximilian began to implement long-term changes that would cement his control over both spiritual and temporal aspects of regional life. New religious doctrines were introduced that emphasized the divine nature of established authority and the sinful nature of rebellion against legitimate rulers. These theological innovations were presented as recovered ancient teachings rather than contemporary inventions, lending them the authority of tradition while serving Maximilian's immediate political needs. The education of future clergy became a priority for ensuring long-term control of religious institutions. Young men entering religious service were carefully screened for loyalty and indoctrinated with revised theological principles that supported Maximilian's vision of unified spiritual and temporal authority. Those who showed exceptional aptitude for the more subtle aspects of religious leadership received additional training in areas that would have shocked conventional believers, learning to use their sacred authority as a cover for intelligence gathering and political manipulation. The sacred authority that Maximilian now wielded extended far beyond the borders of his original territory, as religious influence recognized no political boundaries. Priests loyal to the high sanctum carried his influence into neighboring regions, spreading his theological innovations while gathering intelligence about potential expansion opportunities. Religious pilgrimages became reconnaissance missions, with faithful believers unknowingly serving as carriers of messages and observers of strategic information that could be useful for future military or political operations. The blood and crown that Maximilian had pursued for so many years were finally united in his person, creating a concentration of power that made him virtually untouchable by conventional opposition. The sacred nature of his religious authority made direct attacks upon his person not merely dangerous but blasphemous, while his mastery of poison arts ensured that any enemies who did manage to get close enough to threaten him would not survive the attempt. The foundation of absolute power had been laid through patience, cunning, and an understanding that true dominance required legitimacy as well as fear. The greatest threat to Maximilian's carefully constructed empire came not from external enemies or political rivals, but from within his own bloodline. Caesar Mortavia, his eldest son and designated heir, possessed the same ruthless intelligence that had elevated his father to unprecedented power, combined with an ambition that recognized no limits and acknowledged no authority beyond his own desires. At 25 years of age, Caesar had already demonstrated a mastery of intrigue and violence that surpassed many men twice his age, making him simultaneously the greatest asset and the most dangerous liability in the Mortavia dynasty. Unlike his father, who had been forced to build power from relative obscurity, Caesar had been raised from birth as the inheritor of an established empire. This privileged position had shaped his character in ways that both pleased and disturbed Maximilian, creating a young man who understood power as his natural birthright, rather than something to be carefully earned and maintained. Where Maximilian had learned patience through necessity, Caesar displayed an impatience that could be both strategic asset and fatal weakness, depending upon the circumstances in which it manifested. The relationship between father and son had been complicated from Caesar's earliest years by the fundamental contradiction between Maximilian's need for a competent successor and his recognition that any truly competent heir would inevitably become a rival. Maximilian's own rise to power had required the elimination of his brothers and father, establishing a family precedent that made trust between generations virtually impossible. Every lesson he taught his son about statecraft and assassination carried the implicit understanding that these same skills might eventually be turned against their teacher. Cesar's education had been carefully designed to prepare him for leadership while limiting his immediate access to the tools necessary for patricide. He received extensive training in military strategy, political manipulation, and the subtle arts of poison, but always under careful supervision that prevented him from acquiring knowledge or resources that could threaten his father's position. Master teachers from across the known world were brought to Sanctum Castle to educate the heir, though few of them lived long enough to witness their students' full development, their usefulness typically ending with their lives once their knowledge had been transferred. The young man who emerged from this intensive education was a formidable figure in his own right, combining his father's intellectual gifts with a physical presence that commanded respect through intimidation as well as authority. Caesar stood nearly a head taller than most men, his frame lean but powerful from years of weapons training and physical conditioning. His dark eyes held the same calculating coldness that characterized his father, but with an additional element of barely contained violence that suggested a more direct approach to problem-solving than Maximilian typically preferred. Caesar's first independent operation had occurred when he was barely 18, eliminating a minor lord, whose territory bordered Mortavia lands, and whose continued existence represented an obstacle to expansion. Rather than employing his father's preferred methods of slow poison and careful misdirection, Caesar had orchestrated a more dramatic assassination during a public festival, arranging for his target to be trampled by panicked horses in what appeared to be a tragic accident. The operation's success demonstrated his competence, but its flamboyant execution style revealed a personality that craved recognition and dramatic effect in ways that could prove problematic for the family's traditionally subtle approach. The success of this initial assignment led to increasingly important responsibilities, as Maximilian gradually allowed his son to take leadership of operations that were essential to maintaining Mortavia power. Caesar's management of the family's extensive spy network proved particularly effective, his combination of generous rewards for loyalty and creative punishments for betrayal creating an organization that was both more efficient and more feared than it had been under previous leadership. His agents reported directly to him rather than through intermediaries, giving him access to intelligence that sometimes reached him before it was shared with his father. This growing independence inevitably created tensions within the family hierarchy, as Cesare began to develop his own vision for how Mortavia power should be exercised and expanded. Where Maximilian favored gradual expansion through careful elimination of key obstacles, Cesare advocated for more aggressive territorial acquisition that would establish the family as an openly imperial power rather than merely a regional authority operating behind facades of legitimacy. These strategic disagreements reflected deeper philosophical differences about the nature of power and the methods by which it should be maintained. The first serious conflict between father and son arose over the handling of a rebellion in the southern territories that had been recently acquired through Maximilian's typical methods of targeted assassination and political manipulation. Local lords who had initially submitted to Mortavia authority began showing signs of organizing resistance, apparently believing that their geographic distance from Sanctum Castle would protect them from immediate retaliation. Maximilian's instinct was to respond with his usual approach of selective poisoning and gradual demoralization. But Cesare argued for a military solution that would demonstrate Mortavia power through overwhelming force. The debate between these approaches revealed fundamental differences in their understanding of how fear should be applied to maintain control. Maximilian believed that the most effective terror was subtle and mysterious, leaving enemies uncertain about the source of their problems while creating an atmosphere of paranoia that prevented organized resistance. Cesare argued that spectacular displays of violence were more efficient, creating immediate submission while establishing clear consequences for defiance that would deter future challenges to family authority. When Maximilian ultimately decided to proceed with his traditional methods, Cesare's apparent acceptance of this decision concealed his actual intentions to pursue a parallel course of action. While his father's agents worked to identify and eliminate key resistance leaders through poison and accident, Cesare secretly assembled a military force drawn from the family's most loyal retainers and supplemented with mercenaries whose allegiance could be purchased with generous compensation. His plan was to launch a surprise attack that would crush the rebellion before his father's slower methods could take effect, demonstrating the superiority of direct action while positioning himself as the architect of victory. The campaign that followed became a devastating display of Cesare's military capabilities, combined with his inherited talent for strategic ruthlessness. Rather than simply defeating the rebel forces in conventional battle, he orchestrated a series of coordinated strikes that eliminated not only the active combatants, but also their families, supporters, and anyone who might serve as a rallying point for future resistance. Entire bloodlines were exterminated to prevent vengeance, while the property and assets of the defeated were redistributed among those who had remained loyal to Mortavia authority. The efficiency and thoroughness of Cesare's victory achieved objectives that would have taken his father's methods months or years to accomplish, but at the cost of creating a level of fear and hatred that made future governance of the region significantly more difficult. Where Maximilian's subtle approach typically left survivors who could be converted into loyal supporters through careful manipulation, Cesare's brutal efficiency had created a wasteland populated by terrified subjects who submitted only because they had no alternatives remaining. The victory was complete but sterile, establishing control without creating the foundation for long-term stability. Maximilian's reaction to his son's unauthorized military campaign revealed the complexity of their relationship and the fundamental contradictions inherent in their family's approach to power. On one level, he was forced to acknowledge the effectiveness of Cesare's methods and their contribution to overall Mortavia objectives, making public criticism impossible without undermining family unity. On another level, he recognized the dangerous precedent established by his heir's willingness to act independently on matters of strategic importance, creating a pattern that could ultimately threaten his own authority if allowed to continue unchecked. The resolution of this conflict required a delicate balance between acknowledging Cesare's success and reasserting paternal authority over family operations. Maximilian publicly praised his son's military achievements while privately making it clear that future operations would require explicit approval before implementation. This compromise satisfied neither father nor son completely, creating an ongoing tension that would influence their relationship for years to come, while establishing patterns of mutual suspicion and careful maneuvering that characterized their subsequent interactions. Caesar's response to these limitations revealed the extent to which he had internalized the family's fundamental approach to obstacle removal, even when those obstacles were members of his own bloodline. Rather than accepting his father's restrictions, he began developing alternative power bases that would allow him to pursue his own agenda regardless of paternal approval. His cultivation of personal loyalty among key military commanders, intelligence operatives, and regional administrators created a shadow organization within the larger Mortavia structure, answerable to him rather than to his father. The development of these parallel loyalties was facilitated by Cesare's willingness to share credit and rewards in ways that his father had never practiced, creating bonds of mutual interest that were potentially stronger than the fear-based compliance that characterized traditional Mortavia relationships. His supporters were motivated not merely by terror of consequences for disloyalty, but by genuine appreciation for the opportunities and advancement that service to Cesare provided. This positive motivation created a more reliable foundation for long-term allegiance, though it also required resources and concessions that Maximilian's methods had never demanded. The growing strength of Cesare's independent power base inevitably came to Maximilian's attention through the extensive surveillance network that monitored all activities within Mortavia territory. including those of family members. The discovery that his son was building alternative loyalties created a dilemma that struck at the heart of the contradiction between effective succession planning and personal survival. Eliminating Cesare would solve the immediate threat, but would also destroy the most competent potential successor and create succession uncertainties that could destabilize the entire empire. The solution that Maximilian ultimately implemented reflected his understanding that direct confrontation with his son would likely result in civil war that could destroy everything he had built, regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. Instead of attempting to dismantle Cesare's power base through force, he began a more subtle campaign designed to limit his son's effectiveness while creating the appearance of continued cooperation and family unity. This approach required a level of psychological manipulation that surpassed even his previous achievements in the field of interpersonal deception. The key to Maximilian's strategy lay in his recognition that Cesare's greatest strength, his military and organizational competence, could be turned into a weakness through careful management of the situations in which these abilities were employed. By assigning his son to operations that were designed to fail despite competent execution, Maximilian could gradually undermine Cesare's reputation and confidence, while maintaining plausible deniability about his own role in these setbacks. The goal was not immediate destruction, but gradual erosion of his son's position until he could be safely eliminated or permanently neutralized. The first test of this approach came when Maximilian assigned Cesare to negotiate a complex trade agreement with merchant princes from the Eastern Territories, a task that appeared to play to his son's strengths while actually being structured to ensure failure regardless of the negotiator's skill. The terms that Maximilian secretly demanded were intentionally impossible for the merchants to accept, while the intelligence provided to Cesare about their positions and motivations was subtly but significantly inaccurate. When the negotiations inevitably collapsed, Cesare bore responsibility for the failure despite having executed his assigned role with reasonable competence. This pattern was repeated across multiple operations over several months, each apparent assignment containing hidden elements that made success impossible while maintaining the appearance of legitimate delegation of authority. Cesare's growing frustration with these setbacks was exactly what Maximilian intended, as it gradually eroded his son's confidence while creating doubt among his supporters about his actual capabilities. The psychological pressure of repeated failures, combined with his inability to identify the source of these problems, began to affect Cesare's judgment and decision-making in ways that created additional opportunities for manipulation. The cumulative effect of these orchestrated failures was to create a situation where Cesare's elimination could be justified as necessary for the good of the family and the empire, rather than appearing to be the result of personal rivalry or succession anxiety. When evidence began to surface suggesting that Cesare's repeated failures might be the result of treasonous contact with enemy agents, his position became increasingly untenable regardless of his actual innocence. The evidence was fabricated, but it was crafted with sufficient skill to be convincing even to those who had previously supported him without question. The final phase of Maximilian's campaign against his son required the most delicate timing and execution, as it involved arranging circumstances that would result in Cesare's death while maintaining the appearance that the elimination was either accidental or the result of enemy action rather than patricide. The opportunity arose during a diplomatic mission to negotiate with potentially hostile neighbors, a legitimate assignment that provided perfect cover for the orchestration of a fatal ambush that would appear to be the work of foreign enemies rather than family betrayal. Caesar's assassination was carried out with the same meticulous planning that characterized all Mortavia operations, but with the additional complexity of ensuring that none of the evidence pointed back toward Sanctum Castle or its ruler. The attack was staged to appear as though local bandits had targeted the diplomatic party for its valuable cargo, with Caesar's death being an unfortunate consequence of resistance to robbery rather than the primary objective of the operation. The surviving members of his escort, carefully selected for their loyalty to Maximilian rather than his son, provided testimony that supported this interpretation of events. The public reaction to Cesare's death was everything that Maximilian had hoped to achieve, combining genuine grief at the loss of a promising heir with anger directed toward the foreign enemies who were blamed for the assassination. Rather than creating suspicion about internal family dynamics, the death served to unite Mortavia supporters behind their remaining leadership, while justifying subsequent military actions against the territories where the ambush had occurred. The elimination of a dangerous rival had been transformed into a rallying cry for expansion and revenge. The removal of Cesare from the succession created new opportunities for Maximilian to reshape family dynamics according to his preferences, but it also highlighted the fundamental problem that would continue to plague the Mortavia dynasty. As long as it relied on succession through bloodline inheritance, any competent heir would inevitably become a threat, while incompetent heirs would threaten the survival of the empire through their inability to maintain control. The solution to this paradox would require innovations in governance that went beyond traditional models of family-based authority. The lessons learned from the conflict with Cesare influenced Maximilian's approach to his remaining children, as he recognized the need to balance preparation for succession with protection against patricide. Future heirs would receive education and experience designed to make them effective rulers without providing them with the resources or knowledge necessary to challenge paternal authority. This delicate balance would require constant adjustment and monitoring, creating an ongoing dynamic of cooperation and competition that would characterize family relationships for generations to come. The blood that had been spilled within the Mortavia family represented more than the elimination of a single threat. It established a precedent that would shape the dynasty's internal relationships for as long as it survived. The knowledge that even family bonds were subordinate to considerations of power and survival created an atmosphere of permanent suspicion and careful calculation that affected every interaction between relatives. Trust became a luxury that no Mortavia could afford, while paranoia became a survival skill as essential as the mastery of poison or political manipulation. The brothers' blood that stained Maximilian's hands marked a turning point in the evolution of his empire, transforming it from a family enterprise built on shared interests into a more purely autocratic system, where individual survival depended entirely upon the supreme ruler's continued approval. This transformation increased the stability of succession in the short term, but created new vulnerabilities that would eventually threaten the dynasty's long-term survival. The price of absolute power was the destruction of the very family bonds that had originally motivated its pursuit. While Maximilian's sons had been groomed for leadership and military command, his daughter Isabella had received an education in power that was perhaps even more sophisticated, though necessarily more subtle, given the constraints that society placed upon female authority. At 19 years of age, she possessed a beauty that was matched only by her intelligence, creating a combination that made her simultaneously the most valuable political asset and the most dangerous weapon in the Mortavia arsenal. Her third marriage ceremony was scheduled for the following week, though whispered rumors throughout the court suggested that her previous two husbands' mysterious deaths made this union more of a death sentence than a celebration. Isabella's education in the feminine arts of power had begun in earliest childhood, when her tutors had taught her that a woman's influence must be exercised through men who believed themselves to be in control while actually serving her purposes. Unlike her brothers, who had been trained to command through direct authority and obvious force, she had learned to manipulate through charm, suggestion, and the careful cultivation of dependencies that made her indispensable to those she sought to control. Her weapons were smiles and tears, whispered confidences and strategic silences. But behind these traditionally feminine tools lay a mind as calculating and ruthless as any in the Mortavia bloodline. The first marriage arrangement had been concluded when Isabella was barely 16, uniting her with Lord Marquis of Ravencrest, a young nobleman whose family controlled important mountain passes that provided access to lucrative trade routes. The alliance was designed to secure Mortavia interests in the northern territories, while providing Isabella with practical experience in the application of feminine influence within a marital relationship. What neither her father nor her husband had anticipated was the speed with which she would master these lessons and begin applying them for her own purposes rather than merely serving as an instrument of family policy. Lord Marcus had been a pleasant enough young man, possessed of reasonable intelligence and adequate charm, but lacking the suspicious nature that might have protected him from the subtle dangers that surrounded him after his marriage into the Mortavia family. His death, occurring barely 8 months after the wedding ceremony, had been attributed to a virulent fever that had struck suddenly and progressed rapidly despite the attention of the finest physicians available. The grief that Isabella displayed during his final illness and subsequent funeral had been so convincing that few observers questioned the tragic coincidence that had claimed such a young and apparently healthy husband. The truth, known only to Isabella herself and the master poisoner who had provided her training, was significantly more complex than the official version of events suggested. Lord Marcus had indeed died from fever, but the illness had been induced through careful administration of a sophisticated toxin that replicated the symptoms of natural disease while gradually destroying his internal organs. The poison, derived from a rare fungus that grew only in the deepest caves beneath Sanctum Castle, had been administered over several weeks through intimate contact that made detection virtually impossible. Isabella's method of delivery had been both elegant and deeply personal, involving the application of the toxin to her own skin in areas where marital intimacy would ensure absorption by her husband, while leaving her own system unaffected due to carefully timed administration of antidotes. This technique required not only extensive knowledge of the poison's properties but also precise timing and dosage calculations that demonstrated a mastery of the assassin's art that rivaled her father's own expertise. The fact that she had developed this capability independently, without direct instruction from family teachers, suggested an intuitive understanding of toxic substances that made her potentially more dangerous than any of her male relatives. The second marriage had been arranged with equal care to advance Mortavia political objectives, though this time Maximilian had selected a husband who seemed better equipped to survive the experience. Count Alessandro of Brightwater was known throughout the region for his paranoid nature and extensive precautions against assassination, making him theoretically safer from the kind of intimate poisoning that had claimed his predecessor. His castle employed multiple food tasters, maintained extensive security measures, and even required separate sleeping chambers for married couples as protection against nocturnal attacks. What Count Alessandro had failed to anticipate was that his new wife's education in lethal arts extended far beyond simple poisoning to encompass a thorough understanding of psychology and the exploitation of human weaknesses. Rather than attempting to overcome his security measures through superior toxicology, Isabella chose to use his own paranoid nature as the weapon that would ultimately destroy him. Her campaign against her second husband was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that demonstrated her ability to kill through fear as effectively as through chemical means. The process began with subtle suggestions that his security measures, however extensive, were inadequate to protect against the sophisticated threats that marriage into the Mortavia family inevitably attracted. Isabella's apparent concern for his safety, combined with her detailed knowledge of assassination techniques, created an atmosphere of escalating anxiety that made him increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. She shared carefully selected stories about previous attempts on family members' lives, always emphasizing the cleverness of the attackers and the inadequacy of conventional defenses against truly determined enemies. As weeks passed, Count Alessandro's paranoia intensified beyond rational bounds, fed by his wife's seemingly innocent observations about potential security vulnerabilities, and her growing collection of protective talismans and defensive preparations. He began viewing every servant as a potential assassin, every meal as a possible delivery system for poison, and every social interaction as an opportunity for enemy agents to gather intelligence or position themselves for attack. His sleep became fitful and interrupted, his appetite diminished due to excessive caution about food safety, and his judgment increasingly impaired by the constant stress of anticipated assassination. Isabella's genius lay in her recognition that she need not actually attack her husband to destroy him. She merely needed to convince him that such attacks were imminent and inevitable, while simultaneously undermining his confidence in any possible defense. Her suggestions about additional security measures were always reasonable and well-informed, but they invariably highlighted new vulnerabilities that required even more extensive precautions. Each protective measure she recommended served to reinforce his belief that the threats were real and growing more sophisticated, creating a spiral of fear that eventually consumed his ability to function normally. The climax of this psychological campaign occurred during a diplomatic reception where Count Alessandro's paranoid behavior had become so extreme that he publicly accused several prominent guests of plotting his assassination, creating a scandal that damaged his political relationships while confirming his reputation as an unstable and potentially dangerous ally. His subsequent confinement to his chambers, ostensibly for his own protection but actually representing a form of self-imposed imprisonment, marked the beginning of his final decline into complete mental collapse. Count Alessandro's death came not from poison or violence, but from the complete breakdown of his physical and mental health under the sustained pressure of constant terror. His heart, weakened by months of sleepless nights and chronic anxiety, finally failed during one of his increasingly frequent panic attacks about imaginary assassination attempts. The physicians who examined his body found no evidence of foul play, though they noted the extreme deterioration of his overall condition that had preceded his fatal heart failure. Isabella's grief at her second husband's death appeared even more profound than her mourning for the first, as she had spent months appearing to share his fears and support his protective measures. Her apparent devotion to his safety and her visible distress at being unable to save him from his own anxieties created a public image of a devoted wife who had been twice victimized by tragic circumstances beyond her control. The suggestion that she might be cursed, doomed to lose every husband despite her best efforts to protect them, only enhanced her reputation as a figure deserving of sympathy rather than suspicion. The pattern of her husband's deaths had not escaped the attention of potential future partners, making the arrangement of her third marriage significantly more challenging, despite the obvious political advantages that alliance with the Mortavia family would provide. The man who had ultimately agreed to marry Isabella was Lord Federico of Goldenvale, an aging widower whose own advanced years and practical nature suggested that he viewed the arrangement as a calculated risk worth taking for the substantial dowry and political connections that the union would provide. Lord Federico's approach to marriage with Isabella revealed a sophisticated understanding of the risks involved, though his protective strategies reflected conventional thinking about assassination rather than the psychological subtleties that she had mastered. He maintained his own residence rather than moving into Mortavia territory, employed extensive security personnel drawn from his own trusted retainers, and insisted on maintaining separate living arrangements that would limit opportunities for intimate contact. His precautions were comprehensive and well-planned, but they failed to account for the possibility that his new wife's deadliest weapons were not physical substances, but her ability to manipulate the very security measures designed to protect him. Isabella's strategy for her third husband required significant adaptation from her previous approaches, as his age and experience made him less susceptible to the psychological manipulation that had proven so effective against Count Alessandro, while his security arrangements made the intimate poisoning that had eliminated Lord Marcus extremely difficult to accomplish. Instead, she chose to focus on longer-term objectives, positioning herself to inherit his substantial estates while simultaneously using their marriage to advance broader Mortavia interests in his territory. The cultivation of alternative power bases within Lord Federico's domain became Isabella's primary objective, as she recognized that direct elimination of her husband would be less valuable than gradual assumption of control over his political and economic resources. Her charm and intelligence, combined with her reputation as a tragic figure who had suffered repeated losses, made her popular among his retainers and local nobles, who began viewing her as a more sympathetic and accessible representative of authority than her elderly husband. Isabella's network of supporters within Goldenvale territory grew steadily as she demonstrated her value as an intermediary between local interests and broader Mortavia policy objectives. Her ability to secure favorable trade agreements, resolve disputes through family connections, and provide access to resources that would otherwise be unavailable made her increasingly indispensable to the region's economic and political stability. The loyalty she cultivated was based on mutual benefit rather than fear, creating stronger and more reliable foundations for long-term control than traditional Mortavia methods typically achieve. The transformation of Isabella from a political marriage pawn into an independent power broker represented a significant evolution in her personal capabilities. But it also created potential conflicts with family interests that required careful management. Her growing influence in Goldenvale territory made her valuable to overall Mortavia objectives, but her increasing independence from direct family control created possibilities for future conflicts if her interests diverged from those of her father and surviving brothers. The balance between autonomy and loyalty would require constant attention as her power continued to grow. Lord Federico's recognition of his wife's growing influence created a complex dynamic within their marriage, as he simultaneously benefited from her political connections while becoming increasingly dependent upon her for maintaining his own authority. His attempts to limit her activities were constrained by the practical reality that many of his most important relationships now depended upon her continued involvement, making direct confrontation with her potentially more dangerous to his position than allowing her continued autonomy. The poison that Isabella had mastered was not limited to chemical substances, but extended to the more subtle toxins of dependency and manipulation that could corrupt relationships and institutions as effectively as any physical weapon. Her understanding of human nature allowed her to identify and exploit weaknesses that were often invisible to her victims until the damage had become irreversible. The deaths of her first two husbands had taught her that destruction could be achieved through methods that left no physical evidence while creating outcomes that served her purposes perfectly. The curse that seemed to follow Isabella's marriages was actually the manifestation of her own carefully applied talents, refined through practice and adaptation to meet the specific challenges presented by each relationship. Her reputation as a figure of tragic destiny provided perfect cover for activities that would have attracted suspicion if attributed to conscious planning and execution. The combination of beauty, intelligence, and apparent vulnerability created a persona that disarmed potential enemies while positioning her to strike when opportunities presented themselves. The lessons learned through her matrimonial experiences had transformed Isabella from a naive young woman into one of the most dangerous political operators in the region, possessing skills that complemented and in some ways exceeded those of her male relatives. Her mastery of psychological manipulation, combined with her growing network of personal loyalties and her intimate knowledge of poison craft, made her a formidable asset to family objectives while simultaneously representing a potential threat to anyone who might underestimate her capabilities. The curse of Isabella Mortavia was not supernatural but scientific, not destiny but design. Each marriage had served as a laboratory for testing and refining techniques that would make her increasingly effective as an instrument of family policy and personal ambition. The deaths that marked her path were not tragic accidents but calculated achievements, each one advancing her education in the arts of power, while eliminating obstacles to her continued advancement within the brutal hierarchy of noble politics. As her third marriage approached its inevitable conclusion, Isabella had become perhaps the most accomplished practitioner of the Mortavia family's core philosophy that poison conquers all. Her weapons were more subtle than those employed by her father and brothers, but they were no less deadly for their refinement. The curse that followed her was actually the blessing of superior skill applied with ruthless precision, creating outcomes that served her purposes while maintaining the appearance of innocent misfortune that protected her from retaliation or suspicion. The decade following Cesare's elimination and Isabella's matrimonial triumphs marked the absolute pinnacle of Mortavia power. as the family's influence expanded to encompass territories that stretched from the northern mountain passes to the southern coastal regions. What had begun as a modest lordship centered around Sanctum Castle had evolved into an empire that controlled trade routes, commanded the loyalty of dozens of noble houses, and wielded both temporal and spiritual authority over millions of subjects. The combination of Maximilian's strategic genius, Isabella's psychological sophistication, and the systematic elimination of potential rivals had created a concentration of power that seemed unassailable by conventional opposition. The imperial court at Sanctum Castle had become the undisputed center of political authority for the entire region, drawing ambitious nobles, wealthy merchants, and influential clergy who understood that proximity to Mortavia power was essential for advancement in any field of endeavor. The castle's great halls, once designed to accommodate the modest household of a minor lord, had been expanded repeatedly to house the hundreds of courtiers, advisors, servants, and guards necessary to maintain an imperial administration. The architectural additions reflected the family's growing confidence, featuring elaborate decorations and luxurious appointments that proclaimed their status while simultaneously serving practical functions related to their preferred methods of conducting business. The throne room itself had been redesigned as a masterpiece of intimidating grandeur, with soaring columns that supported a vaulted ceiling, decorated with frescoes depicting scenes of divine judgment and mortal submission. The Mortavia coat of arms, featuring the silver chalice surrounded by thorny vines, was repeated throughout the chamber in precious metals and jewels that caught the light from hundreds of candles arranged to create dramatic shadows that shifted with every movement. The throne, carved from a single block of black marble and inlaid with silver designs that seemed to writhe in the flickering illumination, dominated the space with a presence that reminded every visitor of the power that resided within these walls. The daily routine of imperial governance had evolved into an elaborate ceremony that combined practical administration with psychological theater, designed to reinforce the mystique of Mortavia authority. Morning audiences began with religious observances, led by Maximilian in his capacity as High Sanctum, establishing the divine nature of his secular power while identifying any subjects whose devotion might be questioned. The transition from spiritual leader to temporal ruler was marked by the ceremonial exchange of religious vestments for imperial regalia, a ritual that symbolized the unity of sacred and worldly authority under his personal command. The petitions and disputes brought before the imperial throne provided opportunities to demonstrate both justice and ruthlessness, often within the same judgment, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that kept subjects focused on pleasing their ruler rather than pursuing independent agendas. Maximilian's decisions were invariably presented as divinely inspired wisdom, even when they clearly served partisan political purposes, reinforcing the religious foundations of his authority, while making opposition appear not merely rebellious, but blasphemous. The integration of spiritual and temporal power had created a form of government that was virtually immune to conventional challenges. The economic foundations of the empire rested upon the systematic exploitation of trade relationships that had been established through the careful elimination of competitors and the strategic placement of Mortavia loyalists in key commercial positions throughout the region. Every major trade route passed through territory under family control, generating customs revenues that funded the extensive intelligence networks and specialized personnel necessary to maintain dominance through assassination and manipulation. The wealth that flowed into Sanctum Castle from these activities exceeded the treasuries of many traditional kingdoms, providing resources that could be deployed to solve virtually any problem that arose. The merchant princes who had once operated as independent power brokers found themselves transformed into dependent clients whose continued prosperity required ongoing Mortavia approval, creating a commercial system that served imperial interests while maintaining the appearance of free enterprise. Those who attempted to establish alternative trade networks or circumvent Mortavia control discovered that their business partnerships dissolved mysteriously, Their key personnel suffered unfortunate accidents, and their financial resources vanished through mechanisms that were impossible to trace or challenge legally. The invisible hand of the market had been replaced by the very visible threat of assassination. Isabella's growing network of influence within the territories acquired through her marriages had become an essential component of imperial administration, providing intelligence and control mechanisms that complemented her father's more traditional methods of maintaining authority. Her ability to cultivate personal loyalty among local leaders created a form of governance that was more stable and efficient than systems based purely on fear, though it also required ongoing attention to the needs and interests of her supporters that sometimes conflicted with broader family objectives. The balance between autonomous regional authority and centralized imperial control remained a source of ongoing tension within the family's political strategy. The military forces available to the Mortavia Empire represented a synthesis of conventional armies and specialized units trained in assassination and psychological warfare, creating a fighting force that could achieve objectives through either open battle or covert operations, depending upon the specific requirements of each situation. The regular troops, drawn from territories throughout the empire and commanded by officers whose loyalty had been secured through careful selection and generous rewards, provided the foundation for maintaining order and defending against external threats. These conventional forces were supplemented by elite units whose existence was officially denied but whose capabilities were whispered about in fearful tones throughout neighboring regions. The assassination corps that served as the Empire's most specialized military asset had been developed through decades of careful recruitment and training, creating an organization that combined the technical expertise of master poisoners with the operational capabilities of elite soldiers. These operatives could function independently for extended periods, maintaining cover identities while carrying out missions that required months or years to complete successfully. Their targets were typically not enemy soldiers but the political, economic, and religious leaders whose elimination would achieve strategic objectives more efficiently than conventional military campaigns. The intelligence networks that supported these operations had been woven into the fabric of society throughout the Empire and beyond, creating information-gathering capabilities that exceeded those of any conventional government or military organization. Merchants, clergy, servants, and nobles who served as sources and conduits for intelligence were often unaware of their role in the larger system, providing information and carrying messages without understanding the broader purposes their activities served. This compartmentalized approach ensured that the discovery of individual agents would not compromise the entire network while maintaining operational security that protected the most sensitive aspects of imperial planning. The psychological warfare capabilities that the Empire had developed represented perhaps its most innovative and effective tool for maintaining control over both subjects and enemies. Rather than simply eliminating opponents, Mortavia operations were designed to create examples that would deter future resistance while spreading fear among potential enemies. Public deaths that appeared to be accidents or natural causes served to reinforce the family's reputation for supernatural power while avoiding the martyrdom that could result from obvious political assassinations. The message was clear. Opposition to Mortavia authority was not merely dangerous but futile, as their reach extended into every aspect of daily life. The cultural transformation that accompanied the Empire's expansion included the systematic promotion of artistic and intellectual activities that served to legitimize Mortavia rule, while subtly reinforcing the social hierarchies that supported their authority. Patronage of painters, sculptors, musicians, and scholars created a flourishing cultural environment that attracted talented individuals from throughout the known world, while ensuring that their works celebrated imperial achievements and promoted acceptable interpretations of political and religious doctrine. The imperial court became a center of learning and artistic achievement that rivaled the greatest capitals of antiquity. The architectural projects undertaken during this period of expansion served both practical and symbolic functions. creating monuments to Mortavia power while providing facilities necessary for imperial administration and defense. New palaces, administrative buildings, and fortifications were constructed using innovative techniques that demonstrated the empire's technological sophistication while employing design elements that reminded viewers of the consequences of challenging established authority. The integration of defensive features into decorative elements created structures that were simultaneously beautiful and menacing, reflecting the dual nature of imperial power. The religious innovations that Maximilian introduced during his tenure as High Sanctum gradually transformed the spiritual landscape of the empire, creating theological foundations that supported temporal authority while eliminating doctrinal elements that might encourage resistance or independent thinking. New festivals and ceremonies were established that celebrated imperial achievements alongside traditional religious observances, while existing rituals were modified to emphasize the divine nature of established authority and the sinful character of rebellion against legitimate rulers. The fusion of political and religious authority had created a state religion that served imperial purposes while maintaining the appearance of spiritual legitimacy. The legal system that governed the empire reflected the same synthesis of practical necessity and psychological manipulation that characterized other aspects of Mortavia rule, creating laws that appeared to provide justice and protection while actually serving to concentrate power and eliminate potential threats. Criminal penalties were structured to deter opposition rather than simply punish wrongdoing, with sentences designed to create public examples while providing opportunities for the discreet elimination of individuals whose continued existence posed risks to imperial security. The administration of justice became another tool for maintaining control rather than an independent check on governmental power. The educational institutions that served the empire's elite performed the crucial function of training future leaders, while ensuring that their worldviews and loyalties aligned with imperial interests. Students from noble families throughout the realm were required to complete their education at academies, controlled by Mortavia appointees, where they received instruction in subjects ranging from classical literature to practical statecraft. The curriculum was carefully designed to produce competent administrators and military officers, while instilling the values and assumptions that would make them reliable servants of imperial authority throughout their careers. The diplomatic relationships that the empire maintained with neighboring powers reflected the sophisticated understanding of international politics that Maximilian had developed through decades of experience in manipulation and assassination. Rather than relying on formal treaties and military alliances, Mortavia foreign policy operated through carefully cultivated personal relationships with key leaders whose loyalty was secured through a combination of mutual benefit and subtle threats. These informal arrangements provided greater flexibility than conventional diplomacy while maintaining the option of eliminating problematic foreign leaders when their interests conflicted with imperial objectives. The succession planning that occupied increasing amounts of Maximilian's attention during this period of imperial zenith required balancing the need for competent leadership against the risks inherent in preparing potential rivals for power. The elimination of Cesare had solved one immediate problem while creating others, as it left the empire dependent upon Maximilian's continued health and effectiveness without obvious alternatives if his leadership was removed through death or incapacity. Isabella's capabilities made her a valuable asset but also a potential source of instability if her interests diverged from those of the central authority. The network of vassal lords who administered imperial territories under Mortavia oversight represented another crucial component of the governmental system that had evolved during the empire's expansion. These nobles, typically drawn from families whose previous independence had been eliminated through assassination or political manipulation, served as regional administrators whose authority derived entirely from imperial appointment rather than hereditary right. Their positions were secure only as long as they demonstrated competence and loyalty, creating incentives for efficient governance, while ensuring that local power could never be used to challenge central authority. The merchant guilds and commercial organizations that operated within the empire had been systematically restructured to serve imperial interests while maintaining the appearance of independence and self-governance. Guild leadership positions were reserved for individuals whose loyalty to Mortavia objectives had been established through careful vetting, while guild regulations were designed to prevent the accumulation of wealth or influence that might threaten imperial authority. The economic prosperity that resulted from these arrangements created widespread support for the existing system while ensuring that commercial success required ongoing imperial approval. The zenith of Mortavia power represented the culmination of decades of patient planning and ruthless execution, creating an empire that seemed to have solved the fundamental problems of governance through the sophisticated application of fear, manipulation, and assassination. The integration of temporal and spiritual authority had eliminated most sources of potential opposition, while the systematic cultivation of dependency among subjects had created a population that actively supported the very system that oppressed them. The empire appeared to have achieved the stability and permanence that had eluded countless previous attempts at imperial governance throughout human history. Yet even at the height of their power, the seeds of future instability were already beginning to sprout within the Mortavia system, hidden beneath the apparent success and universal submission that characterized the Empire's zenith. The very methods that had created this unprecedented concentration of authority contained contradictions and vulnerabilities that would eventually threaten everything that had been built through so much effort and sacrifice. The poison that had conquered all opponents would eventually begin to corrode the foundations of the Empire itself, creating weaknesses that future enemies would learn to exploit. The first cracks in the seemingly impregnable Mortavia Empire appeared not in the form of external military threats or popular uprisings, but through the gradual erosion of the family bonds and institutional loyalties that had originally provided the foundation for their rise to power. As the empire expanded and the original generation of Mortavia leaders aged, the younger members of the dynasty began to develop perspectives and ambitions that diverged from the careful planning and patient methodology that had characterized their predecessor. The very success of the family's approach to governance had created a new generation that took power for granted while lacking the survival instincts that had made that power possible in the first place. Maximilian's remaining sons, who had witnessed the fate that befell Cesare when he challenged paternal authority, had adapted to their circumstances by developing alternative strategies for pursuing their ambitions that avoided direct confrontation, while gradually building independent power bases. Rather than openly opposing their father's decisions, they began implementing subtle modifications to his policies that served their personal interests while maintaining the appearance of loyal compliance. These seemingly minor deviations from established procedures created precedents that would eventually undermine the centralized control that was essential to the empire's stability. The eldest surviving son, Rodrigo, had been assigned responsibility for managing the empire's financial affairs, a position that provided him with detailed knowledge of resource flows and spending patterns throughout the realm. His growing understanding the economic foundations of Mortavia power led him to recognize opportunities for personal enrichment that could be pursued without directly threatening his father's authority. The systematic diversion of imperial revenues into private accounts that he controlled created a parallel financial structure that enhanced his independence, while reducing the resources available for maintaining the spy networks and assassination corps that were essential to imperial security. Rodrigo's financial manipulations were conducted with sufficient sophistication to avoid immediate detection, utilizing accounting techniques that made it virtually impossible to track specific transactions while maintaining the appearance of legitimate administrative expenses. His education in classical languages and mathematics, originally intended to prepare him for effective governance, had instead provided him with the skills necessary to conceal his embezzlement behind layers of complexity that even expert auditors would struggle to unravel. The wealth he accumulated through these activities was invested in properties and business ventures outside the empire's direct control, creating assets that could be preserved even if his activities were eventually discovered. The second surviving son, Luciano, had been given command of the empire's intelligence operations, a role that provided him with access to information about the loyalties and vulnerabilities of virtually every important figure throughout the realm. His comprehensive understanding of the secrets that bound the empire together also revealed the extent to which the entire system depended upon fear and manipulation rather than genuine loyalty or institutional strength. This knowledge led him to begin cultivating alternative relationships that could provide protection if the Mortavia system eventually collapsed, creating networks of mutual obligation that competed with his family loyalties. Luciano's approach to building independent power involved the careful cultivation of personal relationships with key figures throughout the intelligence network, offering them better compensation and advancement opportunities in exchange for primary loyalty to him rather than to the empire as a whole. His position provided perfect cover for these activities, as his communications with agents throughout the realm appeared to be routine administrative business, while actually serving to build a parallel organization that could function independently of imperial oversight. The gradual shift in agent loyalties was nearly impossible to detect from outside the intelligence system, creating a hidden vulnerability that would not become apparent until the crisis deepened. Isabella's growing influence within the territories acquired through her marriages had evolved beyond mere regional administration into something approaching independent sovereignty, as her personal relationships with local leaders provided her with power bases that did not depend upon imperial appointment or approval. Her success in maintaining stability and prosperity within these regions through methods that differed significantly from traditional Mortavia approaches created precedents that challenged the centralized model of governance that had originally enabled the family's rise to power. The loyalty she commanded was based on mutual benefit rather than fear, making it potentially more reliable but also more resistant to external control. The younger generation's modifications to traditional Mortavia methods reflected their recognition that the empire's expansion had created new challenges that might require different approaches than those that had proven successful during the initial phases of growth. Where their father had relied primarily on assassination and intimidation to eliminate opposition, they were experimenting with strategies based on economic manipulation, information control, and alliance building that could achieve similar objectives with lower risks of detection or retaliation. These innovations demonstrated strategic thinking that was in many ways superior to previous approaches, but they also fragmented the unified command structure that had been essential to coordinating complex operations. The aging Maximilian's gradual withdrawal from day-to-day operational management, partly due to declining health and partly due to his increasing focus on philosophical and religious matters, created power vacuums that his children filled according to their individual temperaments and ambitions rather than following coordinated plans designed to maintain imperial unity. His assumption that his offspring would naturally cooperate to preserve the family legacy failed to account for the fundamental changes in circumstances and perspective that success had created. The empire that had been built through ruthless pragmatism was being inherited by a generation that had never experienced the desperation that had originally motivated their family's rise to power. The institutional structures that Maximilian had created to maintain control beyond his personal supervision had been designed with the assumption that family loyalty would provide the ultimate safeguard against internal subversion, but this assumption proved increasingly problematic as the benefits of cooperation became less obvious to individual family members. The intelligence networks, assassination corps, and administrative systems that had been developed to serve imperial objectives could just as easily be adapted to serve personal ambitions, and the skills necessary for imperial governance were also perfectly suited for pursuing independent agendas that might conflict with centralized authority. The external pressures that began to mount against the empire during this period of internal fragmentation reflected the long-term consequences of decades of assassination and manipulation that had eliminated potential allies while creating enduring resentments among surviving enemies. The neighboring powers that had previously been intimidated into submission by Mortavia capabilities began to recognize signs of weakness and coordination difficulties that suggested opportunities for revenge or territorial recovery. The careful balance of fear and mutual benefit that had maintained imperial dominance required constant attention and adjustment that became increasingly difficult to provide as the family's focus shifted toward internal competition. The merchant networks that had been systematically subordinated to imperial interests began showing signs of restiveness as alternative trade routes and commercial relationships became available through the diplomatic initiatives of hostile neighbors. who were eager to weaken Mortavia and control. The prosperity that had originally made imperial oversight acceptable to commercial interests was increasingly offset by the restrictions and tribute requirements that limited growth and independence. The emergence of competitive alternatives to Mortavia-controlled commerce created temptations for economic defection that required constant monitoring and occasional enforcement actions to suppress. The religious authority that had provided legitimacy for temporal power began to face challenges from theological scholars and competing interpretations of doctrine that questioned the divine foundations of imperial rule. The innovations in religious practice that Maximilian had introduced to support his political objectives had created precedents for change that could be exploited by enemies seeking to undermine the spiritual foundations of his authority. Alternative interpretations of sacred texts that emphasized the temporary nature of worldly power and the ultimate accountability of rulers to divine judgment began circulating among populations that had grown weary of imperial demands and restriction. The assassination corps that had been the empire's most feared asset began experiencing operational difficulties as target selection became more complex and the risks of exposure increased due to improved security measures adopted by potential victims who had learned from the fate of their predecessors. The systematic elimination of entire family lines and political factions had created an environment where survival required constant vigilance and sophisticated protective measures that made traditional approaches to assassination increasingly difficult and dangerous. The weapon that had secured the empire's dominance was becoming less reliable just as internal divisions made coordination of operations more challenging. The military forces that protected imperial territory and maintained order among subject populations began showing signs of divided loyalty as regional commanders developed personal relationships with family members who were building independent power bases. The integration of conventional military units with specialized assassination and intelligence personnel had created command structures that were vulnerable to internal subversion, particularly when the loyalties of key officers were influenced by competing incentives and alternative sources of authority. The unity of command that was essential to military effectiveness was gradually eroding as the family itself fragmented into competing factions. The vassal lords who administered imperial territories under Mortavia oversight began developing regional alliances and mutual defense agreements that reduced their dependence upon central authority, while providing alternatives to imperial protection. These arrangements were typically justified as necessary measures for maintaining local security and economic stability. But they also created parallel power structures that could potentially challenge imperial authority if circumstances changed. The decentralization of administrative control that had been necessary for managing an expanded empire was creating opportunities for independence that some vassals were beginning to explore. The cultural and intellectual institutions that had flourished under imperial patronage began producing works that subtly questioned the foundations of Mortavia authority, while celebrating alternative models of governance and social organization. Artists, scholars, and philosophers who had been supported by imperial resources developed increasingly sophisticated critiques of centralized power and hereditary authority that resonated with audiences that had grown tired of arbitrary rule and systematic oppression. The cultural renaissance that the empire had sponsored was beginning to generate ideas that threatened the intellectual foundations of the system that had made it possible. The succession crisis that loomed over the empire as Maximilian aged became increasingly complex due to the competing claims and divided loyalties that had developed among his surviving children. Traditional primogeniture would have designated Rodrigo as heir, but his financial manipulations had created questions about his fitness for supreme authority, while Isabella's success in regional governance suggested that gender might be less important than competence in determining succession. The absence of clear succession principles that could command universal acceptance created uncertainty that encouraged the development of alternative power centers and competing claims to legitimacy. The foreign intelligence operations that neighboring powers had developed to penetrate Mortavia territory began achieving successes that revealed the extent to which internal divisions were weakening imperial security. The recruitment of agents from among disaffected family members ambitious administrators, and oppressed populations, provided enemies with information about imperial capabilities and vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future conflicts. The intelligence networks that had been the Empire's greatest asset were beginning to operate in reverse, serving enemy interests rather than imperial objectives. The economic foundations of imperial power began showing signs of strain as the costs of maintaining extensive intelligence networks, specialized military units, and administrative bureaucracy grew faster than the revenues generated by territorial expansion and commercial exploitation. The systematic elimination of productive populations through assassination and intimidation had reduced the Empire's ability to generate wealth, while increasing the expenses necessary for maintaining control over remaining subjects. The financial sustainability of the imperial system was becoming questionable just as internal divisions were making resource allocation decisions more difficult to coordinate. The psychological warfare capabilities that had been so effective in establishing Mortavia dominance began to lose their impact as target populations developed immunity to traditional forms of intimidation through prolonged exposure and adaptive responses. The fear that had originally ensured compliance was gradually being replaced by resignation and resentment that could potentially be mobilized by enemy agents or internal dissidents seeking to challenge imperial authority. The very methods that had secured the Empire's rise were becoming less effective as circumstances changed and opponents learned to counter them. The poison that had conquered all previous obstacles was beginning to corrode the Empire from within. As the methods that had eliminated external enemies proved equally effective when applied to internal competition and family rivalry, the skills and resources that had been developed to maintain imperial dominance were being turned against the Empire itself by family members who understood the system's vulnerabilities because they had helped create them. The seeds of collapse that had been planted by the Empire's own success were beginning to sprout, threatening to destroy everything that generations of planning and sacrifice had achieved. The final chapter of the Mortavia dynasty began not with external invasion or popular uprising, but with the quiet preparation of a single cup of wine in the private chambers of Sanctum Castle. The liquid that swirled within the crystal goblet appeared no different from any other vintage that might grace an imperial table, but its preparation had required months of careful planning and the application of knowledge that represented the culmination of generations of expertise in the poisoner's art. The person who lifted this final chalice to their lips would complete a circle of betrayal that had begun decades earlier with Maximilian's own rise to power through patricide and fratricide. Isabella stood alone in her father's study, the goblet trembling slightly in her hands as she contemplated the magnitude of what she was about to accomplish. The decision to eliminate Maximilian had not been reached lightly or quickly, but through a gradual recognition that his continued existence represented an insurmountable obstacle to the Empire's survival and her own advancement. The internal divisions that were tearing the family apart could only be resolved through decisive action that would either restore unified leadership or complete the destruction that had already begun. The poison she had prepared would ensure that only one of these outcomes remained possible. The toxin that Isabella had selected for this ultimate betrayal was perhaps the most sophisticated that had ever been created within the Mortavia laboratories, combining elements from multiple sources to create a substance that would produce symptoms indistinguishable from the natural decline that might be expected in a man of Maximilian's advanced years. The poison would work slowly over several days, creating the appearance of a gradual weakening that would allow time for succession arrangements to be implemented while avoiding the suspicion that might arise from sudden death. The formula represented the perfect synthesis of chemical knowledge and political calculation that embodied the family's approach to power. The months of preparation that had preceded this moment had required Isabella to maintain perfect composure while gradually positioning herself to inherit effective control of the Empire, regardless of formal succession arrangements. Her network of personal loyalties throughout the imperial territories provided her with a foundation of support that did not depend upon traditional lines of authority, while her mastery of the family's assassination techniques ensured that potential rivals could be eliminated before they became serious threats. The elimination of Maximilian would remove the last obstacle to her assumption of supreme power, but it would also trigger a crisis that could destroy everything if not managed with exceptional skill. The challenge that Isabella faced was not simply killing her father, but doing so in a manner that would allow her to claim legitimate succession while eliminating the possibility that her brothers might challenge her authority. Rodrigo's control over imperial finances and Luciano's command of intelligence networks made them dangerous opponents who possessed resources that could threaten her position if they chose to contest her claim to power. The solution she had devised required the systematic elimination of all potential rivals within a time frame that would prevent organized resistance while maintaining the appearance of natural causes or external threats. The wine that would deliver Maximilian's death had been prepared using a technique that Isabella had developed independently, based on principles learned from her father's teachings, but refined through her own experimentation and research. The active components were derived from fungi that grew in the deepest caves beneath Sanctum Castle, combined with mineral compounds that enhanced absorption, while masking the characteristic taste that might alert an experienced poison victim to their danger. The resulting mixture was virtually undetectable when properly prepared, requiring sophisticated knowledge to identify even through post-mortem examination. The timing of the assassination had been carefully coordinated with other operations designed to eliminate Rodrigo and Luciano before they could react to their father's death, creating a rapid succession of losses that would appear to be the result of enemy action rather than internal family conflict. Isabella's agents, positioned throughout the empire over many months, were prepared to strike simultaneously at multiple targets, while providing alibis and misdirection that would obscure the true source of these attacks. The campaign would unfold over a period of days, culminating in Isabella's emergence as the sole surviving member of the imperial family and the natural successor to supreme authority. The psychological preparation required for matricide against the man who had taught her everything she knew about power and survival had been perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire plan, requiring Isabella to suppress natural emotional responses while maintaining the cold calculation necessary for effective execution. Her relationship with Maximilian had been complex, combining genuine affection and respect with resentment over the limitations he had placed on her ambitions and the threats he represented to her future security. The decision to eliminate him represented the ultimate application of lessons he had taught her, even as it violated the family bonds that had originally motivated those teachings. The goblet that contained Maximilian's death felt heavier than its actual weight, as Isabella carried it through the corridors toward her father's private chambers, each step bringing her closer to a point of no return that would either secure her triumph or ensure her destruction. The servants and guards she passed showed no unusual interest in her presence, as her visits to discuss family business were routine occurrences that aroused no suspicion. The normalcy of these interactions provided perfect cover for her mission, while creating witnesses who would later testify to her apparent innocence of any involvement in subsequent events. Maximilian received his daughter in his study with the same mixture of affection and weariness that had characterized their relationship for years, accepting the wine she offered as a gesture of filial respect, while remaining alert to any signs of deception or hidden agenda. His long experience with poison and assassination had made him habitually suspicious of food and drink, but the source of this particular offering and the circumstances of its presentation overcame his natural caution. The irony that his own daughter would succeed where countless enemies had failed was lost on him as he lifted the goblet to his lips and consumed the liquid that would end his life. The poison began its work immediately upon consumption, though its effects would not become apparent for several hours as the toxin gradually absorbed into Maximilian's system and began its systematic destruction of his internal organs. Isabella remained with her father for a carefully calculated period, engaging in normal conversation about family affairs and imperial business, while observing for any signs that he had detected the presence of foreign substances in his wine. His behavior remained completely normal throughout their meeting, providing confirmation that the poisoning had proceeded as planned, and that she could safely withdraw without arousing suspicion. The next phase of Isabella's plan required her to establish perfect alibis for the period when Maximilian's symptoms would begin to manifest, ensuring that she could not be connected to his declining health through proximity or opportunity. She arranged to be present at a series of public ceremonies and social gatherings that would provide numerous witnesses to her activities while placing her far from Sanctum Castle when her father's condition began to deteriorate. These appearances also served to reinforce her image as a devoted daughter who was actively fulfilling her duties to family and empire even as the succession crisis approached. The reports that reached Isabella during the following days chronicled Maximilian's gradual decline with the mixture of concern and clinical interest that she had learned to maintain when discussing family members' health problems. His symptoms followed the expected progression: initial weakness and fatigue that could be attributed to his advanced age, followed by digestive difficulties and cognitive confusion that suggested natural deterioration rather than deliberate poisoning. The imperial physicians who attended him were baffled by his condition but found no evidence of foul play, instead attributing his decline to the accumulated stresses of decades of absolute rule. The elimination of Rodrigo occurred on the third day of Maximilian's illness, carried out by agents who had been positioned within his financial administration for months in preparation for this moment. His death was staged to appear as the result of a robbery attempt that had escalated into violence, with valuable items stolen from his residence to support this interpretation of events. The timing created the impression that enemies were taking advantage of the succession crisis to eliminate key imperial leaders, deflecting suspicion from internal family dynamics while removing Isabella's most dangerous potential rival. Luciano's assassination followed within hours, orchestrated by operatives within his own intelligence network who had been converted to Isabella's service through careful cultivation and generous incentives. His death was attributed to retaliation by foreign agents whose operations he had recently disrupted, providing a plausible explanation that reinforced the narrative of external threat rather than internal betrayal. The rapid succession of losses within the imperial family created an atmosphere of crisis that justified extraordinary measures and emergency authority that Isabella was perfectly positioned to assume. The news of his son's deaths reached Maximilian during the final stages of his own decline, adding psychological trauma to the physical deterioration that was already destroying his ability to function as supreme ruler. His rage and grief at these losses accelerated his decline while confirming his suspicions that a coordinated enemy campaign was targeting his family for systematic elimination. The possibility that his own daughter might be responsible for this catastrophe never seriously occurred to him, as the evidence had been too carefully arranged to point toward external rather than internal sources. Isabella's assumption of emergency authority was facilitated by the power vacuum created through the rapid elimination of alternative leadership and the perception that external enemies were mounting a coordinated assault on the imperial system. Her network of personal loyalties throughout the empire provided immediate support for her claim to temporary authority, while the crisis atmosphere made it difficult for potential opponents to organize effective resistance. The transition from daughter to empress occurred with remarkable smoothness considering the violence that had made it possible. The death of Maximilian Mortavia marked the end of an era that had lasted for more than 30 years, during which a single man's vision and ruthlessness had created an empire that dominated an entire region through the systematic application of poison, manipulation, and fear. His final hours were spent in confusion and pain, surrounded by physicians who could not save him and advisors who could not comprehend the scope of the betrayal that had destroyed him. The man who had eliminated countless enemies through careful planning and patient execution was ultimately defeated by his own daughter using methods he had taught her, creating a symmetry that would have been appreciated if he had been capable of recognizing it. The funeral arrangements for the deceased emperor provided Isabella with opportunities to consolidate her authority while demonstrating her commitment to honoring family traditions and imperial continuity. The elaborate ceremonies that marked Maximilian's passing served both to legitimize her succession and to identify potential opponents who might be eliminated before they could organize effective resistance. The mourning period created a temporary suspension of normal political activities that allowed her to implement changes in personnel and policy without appearing to act precipitously or without due consideration. The investigation into the circumstances that had led to the deaths of so many imperial family members was carefully managed to reach conclusions that supported Isabella's preferred narrative while eliminating witnesses or evidence that might contradict the official version of events. The foreign enemies who were blamed for these attacks were conveniently located beyond the reach of imperial justice, making retaliation impossible while providing justification for policies that served Isabella's consolidation of power. The mystery of who had actually orchestrated these eliminations remained officially unsolved, though the true answer was known to only one person. The empire that Isabella inherited was fundamentally different from the one that Maximilian had ruled, as the internal divisions and external pressures that had been building for years had created conditions that required different approaches to governance and control. Her mastery of psychological manipulation and alliance building provided tools that were perhaps better suited to these new circumstances than the traditional Mortavia methods of assassination and intimidation. The transition from the old system to the new represented an evolution in imperial strategy that might have occurred naturally over time, but which had been accelerated through the violent elimination of conservative influences. The legacy of the Mortavia dynasty would ultimately be measured not only by its achievements in concentrating power and eliminating opposition, but by its demonstration that even the most sophisticated systems of control contained the seeds of their own destruction. The methods that had secured the family's rise to power had also provided the tools necessary for internal betrayal and succession through murder. The poison that had conquered all external enemies had proven equally effective when applied to family members who had become obstacles to continued advancement. The final poison that ended Maximilian's life represented the culmination of a tradition that had begun with his own rise to power through the elimination of his father and brothers. The circle of betrayal that had started with patricide was completed with pesticide, demonstrating that the skills and attitudes necessary for acquiring absolute power were incompatible with the trust and loyalty required for stable succession. The empire that had been built on blood would continue to be sustained by blood, as each generation discovered that survival required the elimination of family members who represented threats to their authority. Isabella's triumph marked not the end of the Mortavia legacy, but its transformation into a new form that would adapt to changing circumstances, while preserving the essential elements that had made their dominance possible. The empire would continue to exist, but under leadership that understood the limitations of traditional methods and the need for innovation in the face of evolving challenges. The final poison had eliminated the old order while making possible the emergence of a new one that might prove even more durable and effective than its predecessor. The goblet that had delivered death to the most powerful man in the known world was carefully cleaned and returned to its place among the other treasures of Sanctum Castle, where it would remain as a silent witness to the price of absolute power and the inevitability of betrayal within systems built on violence and deception. Future generations would drink from the same vessel without knowing its history, just as they would inherit an empire without fully understanding the methods by which it had been acquired and maintained. The poison would always be present, waiting for the next moment when family bonds would prove insufficient to restrain ambition and the cycle of betrayal would begin again.